this is an iHeart podcast. Guaranteed human.
Lowe's knows Sundays are for football. So tackle your home improvement projects by Saturday and earn your Sunday with great deals on LG and Bosch appliances, select Ego, DeWalt, Filtrete products, and more. Then once your to-do list is done, get ready to kick back, relax, and enjoy the game. Shop in-store or online now and earn your Sunday with help from Lowe's, official partner of the NFL.
This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa in this episode 1114 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast. Thanks for tuning in. People tend to think of regression to the mean in a negative way. That if someone regresses, that someone got worse. They did something great, and then that greatness turned into goodness or mediocrity. But regression can work in the opposite direction too. Regression to the mean is the tendency for unusually extreme performances, whether they're really good or really bad, to move closer to what's typical over time. If someone does something completely out of this world, chances are he won't be able to repeat that performance. On the flip side, if someone gets all the opportunity in the world and just doesn't come through, it's easy to assume that he's just bad at football. But what if the evidence suggests otherwise? What if he was simply on the wrong side of variance? I say it all the time. I analyze fantasy football through numbers because fantasy football is a game about numbers. And regression is one of the biggest aspects of that. Extreme outcomes are often a mix of skill and randomness. And while skill tends to stick around, randomness usually doesn't. That's why regression is so important to understand. I'd argue it's the most important concept in fantasy football. On today's episode, we're going to dig into regression to the mean. We'll look at players, we'll look at teams who are likely to look different this season. Not because they've suddenly become better or worse, but because some of what happened in 2025 simply wasn't sustainable. Some players benefited from that, others got burned by it. Understanding the difference can help you identify some of the best values in your fantasy drafts this year. Now, before getting into all of that, I did want to send another reminder to check out the Late Round Draft Guide. There's over 270 pages of content that includes game theory, strategy, ways to spot breakouts and busts, players to target, players to avoid, and more. You get cheat sheets in the guide, which includes a cheat sheet of our new market score metric. It's all updated weekly directly to your email inbox. Check it out and learn more at lateround.com. I think the easiest place to start with this episode is with the Rams. Now, obviously, a team led by Sean McVay, and with the amount of offensive talent they have, it's going to be good offensively. But that was also just on another level last year. Now, the Rams had Mike LaFleur now coaching the Arizona Cardinals as their offensive coordinator for 3 years. He got Matthew Stafford for 15, 16, and 17 games during that 3-year stretch. The Rams, during those seasons, threw for 26, 22, and 46 touchdowns. Their touchdown rate, touchdowns divided by attempts, 4.5%, 3.9%, and 7.7%. Since 2011, 14 teams had touchdown rates of 7% or higher in one season while having played another. So the Rams obviously don't qualify for this. Only one of those teams stayed above the 7% mark year over year, but that team, the 2011 Packers, still saw a decline in touchdown rate. They went from 9.2%, which is absolutely insane. I mean, that's peak Aaron Rodgers stuff right there. But it went all the way down to 7.2%. Those teams averaged 42.1 passing touchdowns in that high touchdown rate season. On average, they fell down to 29.6 passing touchdowns the following year. Now, some of you are going to say, well, they got Davante Adams. He drove this figure up. And yeah, for sure, he helped things out. But we also can't just assume that something like that's going to be sustainable year in and year out. Adams in particular is really interesting because obviously he scored 14 times last year. That's a super high number given the amount of volume that he actually saw. And he was often just used as their goal line back essentially. His expected touchdown total was right around that mark. He didn't actually outperform in the touchdown column last year. And I would imagine a lot of people are going to point that out. That Adams won't regress because he performed around expectation when it came to touchdowns last year. But my argument against that is the fact that Adams tied for the most end zone targets last year of any wide receiver since 2011. And he had more inside the 5 targets, inside the 10 targets, and end zone targets per game than any other wide receiver in that sample. His other peripherals were fine, and he converted at a pretty normal rate. He just had so much volume around the end zone. That alone is just naturally going to be difficult to repeat. And here's the math behind that. Adams had 1.93 end zone targets per game last year. Absolutely absurd. That number basically laps every other wide receiver since 2011. But if you look at the wide receivers who had over 1.5 end zone targets per game since 2011, when those guys played 8 or more games the following year, they've historically seen a 35% drop from one season to the next in end zone targets per game. And naturally, their points per game dropped by about 2. Now, this isn't to say that Davante Adams is in a void for me, though I have toyed with the idea because I am a little bit below market. The reason it's not so obvious, though, is because I do think the Rams are still going to be really good offensively. But do keep in mind that it would be shocking, legitimately shocking, to see Adams and Matthew Stafford repeat their 2025 performance. So all of that about the Rams, that's a more obvious spot for regression this year. If you want to go a little bit more outside the box, look at Baltimore and specifically Mark Andrews. There's a very real chance that Mark Andrews is just cooked. I don't think we know for sure, but let's keep an open mind. With that being said, last season, he had a 2.15 yards after the catch per reception rate. That's according to PFF. He's never had a season below 3.19 in that statistic. And even in 2024, if you just want to say, oh, this is just Mark Andrews getting old, he was at 3.58. Now, the interesting thing is that Andrews had a lower average depth of target last year, too. It was the lowest of his career at 8.0 yards. So all of that combined to give him just an atrocious 1.23 yards per route run. The worst of his career by a huge margin. His other lowest was 1.88, which did come in 2024. I would actually anticipate that number improving from one year to the next. But there's a catch. We've had 13 tight ends since 2011 have a yak per reception below 3 in 1 year while hitting 50 or more targets in that season and the following season. 12 of the 13 players improved on that number year over year, and 11 of them, they escaped the 3.0 and below bucket entirely. On average, they've gone from 2.6 yards after the catch per catch to 4.13. That's a strong improvement. The problem is that even though they got better after the catch, we didn't see a massive improvement in fantasy production from those players. Now, albeit it's a smaller sample size. But one of the guys that saw a decline happen, the only one who got worse year over year, was end of career Tony Gonzalez from 2012 to 2013. So look, my stance here is that Andrews isn't necessarily a total fade. He's just a sincerely risky bet, even with favorable yak regression coming. Now let's keep this theme going with the Ravens. One area where Andrews could be helped tremendously is with passing volume. I feel like one of the most overlooked storylines in fantasy football is how unbelievably run-heavy the Ravens were last year, just in terms of raw volume. Baltimore had their second lowest pass rate over expected of the entire Lamar Jackson era last year. But because they ran fewer plays and with Lamar Jackson banged up, they finished the season with just 24.8 pass attempts per game. Since 2011, we've had 17 teams with next season data get to fewer than 28 pass attempts per game. Those teams on average saw an uptick of 4.4 pass attempts per game, 76 raw pass attempts, and nearly 400 passing yards year over year. Just 4 of those teams stayed under the 28 pass attempts per game mark. And remember, Baltimore was under 25 pass attempts per game. This is a key reason that Andrews might be okay. And it's a bigger reason to be bullish on Zay Flowers. The dude was an efficiency machine last year. He took another step forward. And if he's able to see a little bit more work close to the end zone while the Ravens take a step forward in passing volume, it could be a monster year for Flowers. I'm bullish on the Eagles offense turning things around this year. And someone who would benefit from that greatly is Saquon Barkley. Barkley was disappointing last year from a fantasy perspective. He scored fewer than 15 PPR points per game. A huge reason for that lack of production in fantasy, at least the lack of production given his cost, was what he did at the goal line. We know that Jalen Hurts is going to steal touchdowns in that offense, but Barkley still had 14 goal line attempts last year. That was a top 15 number across the league at running back. Each one of those running backs who hit at least 14 goal line rushes scored at least 4 times on those attempts. Saquon Barkley scored once. Now, obviously, Barkley isn't benefiting from the really short stuff at the goal line, but still, this is really bad. We just don't have a large sample of running backs who converted so few goal line attempts one year, who then went on to see a bulky number of goal line rushes the following year. It's not to say that's going to happen to Barkley. It's just such a rarity because he was so bad at converting last year. With that being said, outside of 2025, Barkley's converted about 34% of his goal line rushes. Last year, to repeat, he was at 7%. I would anticipate a nice bounce back from him, at least at the goal line, allowing him to get to that double-digit touchdown mark once again. And if the Eagles' offense does take a step forward versus last year, that shouldn't even be at the detriment of Jalen Hurts, especially because Hurts was far below his typical rushing volume totals last year. But Philly just might score more in general. When talking about regression, of course, general team environment changes are a big reason we see natural shifts in statistics from one year to the next. We should always consider context when we're looking at this stuff. And that's important when I bring up these next two teams, the Vikings and the Raiders. Both struggled last year offensively, ranking bottom 10 in drives ending in scores and drives ending in touchdowns. They were inefficient on offense. That can lower the number of plays that a team runs. If they're not converting, they're not sustaining drives, they're not giving us more plays for fantasy purposes. But then on top of that, they ran at a slower pace. Their seconds per play rates were both bottom 10 in the league. That resulted in the Vikings running 56.1 plays per game last year. Vegas was at 55.8. Now, Miami was in there too, but the other two teams, they're a little bit more interesting given the fantasy implications. But sure, throw Miami in the mix too. 16 teams since 2011 had 58 or fewer plays per game run in a season. The following year, those teams saw an average uptick in plays run per game of 4.8. That equates to about 80 more plays run across the season. And many of those additional plays, they converted to passing plays too. So I think we should see a little bit more passing volume in those two offenses this year. All of those teams with very few plays run in one season, every single one of them saw an uptick in plays run per game the following year. With so much change in Minnesota, given the probable starting quarterback, and then the sweeping change in Vegas, we should expect more plays run for both offenses. That's great news, obviously, for the stud players like Justin Jefferson, Ashton Genty, and Brock Bowers. I'm not going to throw Miami in the mix there, though, because I do think they're in an incredibly unique situation. There's a lot of interesting deep ball data with quarterback each year, and it's no different this year. Drake May was a baller last year on deep passes, and yes, of course there's ability embedded in this. Some dudes are just better at converting throws 15 or more air yards down the field. But May completed over 58% of his passes that traveled 15 or more air yards last season. Among quarterbacks with 30 or more of those types of passes, that's only been done 8 other times since 2011. And since 2011, there have been 24 quarterbacks who had 30 or more deep and intermediate throws in year N and in year N+1, where they had a 53% completion rate on those throws in that original year. So Drake May, 58%, he certainly falls into this group. Of those 24 quarterbacks who had year-over-year 30 or more deep ball throws with a 53% completion rate, they average a drop in completion rate of 7 percentage points. 75% of those players dip below 53%. And Drew Brees is a huge reason that looks as good as it does, because he appeared 6 times on that list. He held at 53% or greater in 3 of those seasons. Meanwhile, these quarterbacks saw a drop of 1.2 points per game year over year, largely because they weren't converting on those deep passes quite as frequently. Now, I know the Patriots added A.J. Brown, and I do think that Drake May is a special player. He could easily buck this trend. It's just something to keep in mind. You can look in the opposite side of this, though, too, because deep ball completion rate, it's a number that regresses. We see a decent number of quarterbacks with below 40% completion rates on deep throws. There have been 145 of them since 2011 who are below that 40% mark, and who had 30 or more deep ball attempts in one year and the next year. Those quarterbacks typically saw an uptick in deep ball completion rate of about 5 percentage points year over year, and they usually increase their fantasy points per game as well by a full point. That's not a huge shock, though. If they're completing those passes more frequently, they're going to score more points. But this is good news for some relevant quarterbacks this year, including Baker Mayfield, CJ Stroud, Jackson Dart, Bo Nix, and Patrick Mahomes. Mahomes is particularly interesting because he used to have seasons above that 45 completion rate mark all the time. But over the last two, he's been at 32% and 36%. That's pretty low. Patrick Mahomes has not been good at converting deep passes the last couple of years. It's not a guarantee that he sees this massive uptick. But I do think that we should project it to happen just strictly based on regression. They just need their down the field threats to stay healthy. And a lot of those other quarterbacks I just named, they have additional help coming. That should aid them in regressing to the mean. Jackson Smith-Njigba just put together one of the most impressive wide receiver seasons that we've ever seen. And typically when things go really well for a player, it's tough to repeat that production. JSN had a yards per target rate of 11 last year. We've had 28 wide receivers since 2011 who had between 10.5 and 11.5 yards per target, while seeing 50 or more targets in year N and in year N+1, so one season and the following season. On average, those players have seen a dip in yards per target of 1.8. Their PPR points per game, it dropped by nearly 1.6. That's not the only thing that was pretty crazy from JSN last year. He had a catch rate over expected of plus 11. And again, historically, players with rates above 10%, they almost always regress. Of the 45 since 2011 who are above that mark, the average drop in actual catch rate was nearly 8 percentage points. And again, those guys saw a dip in points per game of about 1.5. The list goes on and on for JSN. He was great last year, phenomenal, but he probably won't be as efficient this year. But there is one area where things could look better for him in 2026, and that's with overall volume. The Seahawks had a minus 6.7 pass rate over expected last year. Teams who have been between the minus 5% and the minus 8% range since 2011, there's 48 teams, they've typically seen that number increase by over 3 percentage points year over year. Pass attempts per game, that raises by 2.5, and pass rates by about 3 percentage points. Seattle's defense should be excellent again this year, but there's no doubt that the Seattle offense was in a great situation in general last year. They ran the fewest number of plays in the league while trailing. We usually see some volatility with defenses year over year. So odds are that the Seahawks defense, it won't be quite as good as last year. And that could give the Seahawks offense an uptick in passing volume, which hopefully will combat some of this JSN regression. The last item today has to do with the Arizona offense. I think the Cardinals are unbelievably interesting this year for fantasy football. They have really strong weapons and such question marks at quarterback. Well, first off, I think it's important that we're all aware the Cardinals led the league last year in pass attempts. And at over 38 pass attempts per game, regression's likely. 75% of the teams with 35 or more pass attempts per game over the last 5 years saw fewer pass attempts the next year. All those dropbacks also led to a lot of routes run for their pass catchers. Trey McBride ran 67 more routes than any other tight end since at least 2011. I said this before, but if McBride ran the second most routes at tight end last year, or just tied for first, think of it that way. At his same fantasy points per route run rate, he would have fallen from 18.6 PPR points per game to 15.4, which is still a great season. But given what he did in the touchdown column, it doesn't look quite as great. It's a little bit scary. But then Michael Wilson, he ran a lot of routes last year too. Only Jamar Chase ran more routes in the regular season at wide receiver than Michael Wilson did, according to PFF. And it was by just one route. We usually see wide receivers with 600 or more routes in 1 year. Michael Wilson was at 631. We usually see them fall in routes run per game by about 4 year over year. That's something to keep in mind. Now, there are still reasons to believe Arizona is going to be pass heavy this year. They have a bad defense, and as I talked about in the schedule analysis episode, their schedule is actually brutal, which means more negative game scripts and more passing. But look, the bottom line here, there's just so much volatility. I'd anticipate a lower pass rate, and I do think that with a healthy Marvin Harrison Jr., it could flatten out some of that upside for everyone in this offense. Now look, there are obviously a ton of different things that I could have talked about on today's show because regression is everywhere in this numbers-driven game. But I wanted to call out what I think are some of the biggest ones, some of the biggest items when it comes to regression, especially at the team level. Hopefully it made you think a little bit differently about some of these teams and some of these players. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you yet subscribe to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter and on Blue Sky at Late Round QB. Thanks for listening, everyone. As a reminder, the Late Round Fantasy Football YouTube channel, we will be live on Wednesday at noon with the Late Round Fantasy Football Show. We're also doing a lot of live stream best ball drafts, so make sure you're subscribed. YouTube.com/@LateRoundFF. We also have another episode of Becoming a Best Ball Bro dropping this week, and then later in the week, another episode of Late Round Perspectives. It's that time of year. I'm so excited. I hope you are too. Talk to you guys soon.
This is an iHeart podcast. Guaranteed human.